All right, what's going on, guys? This is Rob, and the trailer for Moon Knight is coming out later on tonight, right? It comes out Monday night at the time that we're recording this video. And rumors abound who it is that Ethan Hawke is playing. And as I understand it, Ethan Hawke is actually playing Randall Spector. Although I also have heard rumors that he's playing Sun King, which I really hope is not the case. Anybody who's ever read Moon Knight comics is begging that's not the case, but maybe they'll make him cool. I don't know. I mean, the concept of Sun King was cool. The execution was terribly done. But on the off chance that Ethan Hawke is actually playing Randall Spector, we're going to explain his character here. Now, the thing about this is that it's not going to be an overly lengthy video because there's not a lot to go on when it comes to the character of Randall Spector. He's appeared a few times, done a few things, but he was largely Marvel's attempt to try to beef up interest in Marc Spector, or at the very least to kind of rehash some old story arcs that may serve a purpose. Now, the thing about this is that Randall first appeared in the Hulk magazine with issue number 17. Now, here's something that I do want to clarify here, right? A little bit of an explanation here that's not necessarily tied to Marc Spector, but is more to the Hulk. For those of you guys who are familiar with the Incredible Hulk mythos, bear with me here. For those of you guys who are not, of course, most of you guys know the Incredible Hulk originally appeared back in the day in a 6-issue miniseries, and he was gray. But because of issues with regards to coloring and so on and so forth, Marvel, because of the lack of success as well, canceled the original series, and then when they brought him back, he was green. The idea was, with the Rampaging Hulk storyline, to basically fill in the gaps, right? To say that like the Rampaging Hulk stories or the comic itself took place between the original 6-issue series and then when he returned in the old Tales to Astonish comics. The problem with this is there were a mountain of inconsistencies here. So ultimately Marvel just kind of wrote it all off and just said that it wasn't really in continuity or anything. Some elements were, some elements weren't. You can ignore it and you'll be fine, that kind of a thing. But the idea was that following Rampaging Hulk, that what Marvel did is they transitioned it into what was called the Hulk magazine. And it was, again, kind of an attempt to sort of keep the train of Rampaging Hulk going, which again, people didn't really care too much about. One of the things Marvel tried to do to beef up interest in the Hulk magazine story was to actually include backup features involving like the X-Men, Avengers, different things like that. And one of those was Moon Knight Marc Spector. And so what you ended up getting here with Randall's initial appearance is that he was basically just kind of depicted to us as a guy, at least in the first issues anyway, in issue number 17. He was just a guy who was really more akin to like Jack the Ripper, except instead of going after prostitutes, he was going after nurses and basically just taking them out everywhere that he could find them. He would don this kind of mask that was pretty sick and twisted. He would find them walking the night and then just take them out. And so ultimately what ended up happening is that Marc Spector as Jake Lockley ended up basically tracking this guy down. Now, one of the things to understand, and we do have a video on Moon Knight Explained, it's about 12 minutes long, not my best work. Let me know if you guys want me to like recreate it, right, to redo it and basically do like a more updated version of Moon Knight Explained that really brings into fruition a lot of the stuff that's going on now, but is also more in line with the normal videos that we do. But when it came to Marc Spector, he basically had 3 distinct personalities, 4 if you consider Moon Knight. So you had basically Marc Spector himself, right, the mercenary. Then you had Steve Grant, who was the billionaire. Then you had Jake Lockley, who was the cab driver. And then you had the Moon Knight guy who basically just went around and beat up bad guys in the middle of the night. One of the big things about Marc Spector himself, about Moon Knight, is that he actually gets lost in his own identity. That really came to a head in Jeff Lemire's run of Moon Knight, where basically he ended up just struggling with the multiple personality disorder. That had actually been a theme going on for quite some time and just sort of came to a head in that story, right? So it wasn't as though it was something that was just made up for the sake of that story. But the thing about this is that Jake Lockley was initially the way by which Marc Spector learned about this, right? That he was actually met by Crawley, which funny enough, Crawley is basically just a homeless guy who exists out there, somewhat of an informant that basically is one of the many people that tells the Jake Lockley persona of Marc Spector what's going on the street level, right? Information that he can't readily get on his own. If you look at the little TV spot that we got that featured Ethan Hawke, he looks more like Crawley than anybody else, to be honest with you guys. But I have a hard time believing that Ethan Hawke, one of the most celebrated actors in Hollywood, is going to play some random homeless guy in the Moon Knight show. Maybe he is, I have no real idea here. But basically, Crawley ends up telling Marc Spector that this guy, this traveling around out there, that this guy is basically just like killing nurses, but that he has a personal vendetta against Marc Spector and Marlene, and he's basically trying to track them down. Of course, Marlene being the love interest of Marc Spector. Now, because nobody really knows that Marc Spector is actually Moon Knight, at least none of the people on the street level, that Moon Knight basically picks this up and says, okay, fine, like, it's obviously some kind of a personal vendetta, but I don't really know who this guy is, right? I don't really know what's going on here. And so what actually ends up going on is a kind of, I guess a trap is basically struck or set up between Marlene and Moon Knight, where Marlene will actually masquerade as a nurse in order to lure essentially Randall out, and that when he goes on the attack, that Marc Spector will step in, right? That Moon Knight will basically jump in and basically grab this guy. Now, the kicker about this is that once the trap is initiated, Marlene, of course, fleeing for her life, trying to escape as Marc Spector tracks them, is actually met with some overzealous police officers who end up opening fire and actually hitting Marlene. Now, of course, this basically leads to a fight between Moon Knight and Randall, right, as Randall just kind of takes off. And that's where you kind of get the backstory, right? That essentially what had happened here is that Randall was a mercenary working alongside Marc Spector, but that Randall had actually turned against Marc Spector just because of the fact that he found more money by basically, turning against the people he was working with. And so ultimately a fight ensued, and then it was believed that Randall was dead. And so ultimately Marc Spector ended up basically leaving and became Moon Knight after he met with Bushmen and all them and succumbed to his injuries and all that kind of stuff. And so the fight between the two in this initial story is a knockdown, drag-out fight. Like, quite literally, these guys are basically fighting to the death. Marc Spector doesn't necessarily want to kill Randall, right? He doesn't want to kill his own brother, but at the end of the day, he kind of has to, right? Now, it doesn't really happen by virtue of him breaking his neck or anything like that. Instead, Randall lunges at Marc Spector, and Marc Spector actually dodges out of the way, and that leads to Randall basically being impaled on a tree. And that's it, right? As far as this original story went, that's all you got for Randall. It was one of these times, for those of you guys who aren't really familiar with comics, this is one of those times where the story arc was given to us to see whether or not people would be receptive to it. And if they were, then you could potentially see the return of the character at a future point in time. Now, the reality is that interest in this guy, at least among Moon Knight fans, was there. People were intrigued about the idea of Marc Spector basically having a brother that nobody ever knew about. And of course, people who had been reading comics at this point in time in 1978, 1979, basically knew that you could always kind of bring a character back if you wanted to, right? I mean, this guy was impaled on a tree, which is by no means certain death, right? The guy could recover, he could heal, and then basically face off against Moon Knight yet again, and kind of be this recurring foe. Now, something that I do want to talk about here, and again, this is something that we'll sort of reiterate if we end up going back and doing an actual Moon Knight video. I want to talk about Marc Spector for a second. And the reason why is because understanding the return of Randall Spector later on really requires us to kind of understand some of the stuff that was going on with Marc in between, right? So the thing to understand is that when it comes to the character of Moon Knight, this guy was basically Marvel's Batman. I mean, it wasn't really something that was arguable, right? Like when you compared his comics, the tone, the philosophies, all that kind of stuff, he was by all standards of measurement Batman. But more so than that, in terms of the creative side, the writing of the stories, how they were handled, all that kind of stuff, that was all Doug Moench. From the time he first appeared in Werewolf by Night back in 1975, right, issue number 32, going into Marvel Spotlight issues 28 and 29, Hulk magazine 11 through 15, 17 through 18, issue number 20, Marvel Preview number 21, like all these things, this was all Doug Moench. The only time that I'm aware of where Doug Moench did not handle Moon Knight in the early days was with the old Marvel 2-in-1 number 52 story, which was actually written by Stephen Grant, and then the Defenders issues 47 through 51, which actually had Moon Knight basically hanging out with the team for a little while. There was also a Spectacular Spider-Man story, really a couple stories, issues 22 through 23, but by and large, Moon Knight just sort of circulated around the Marvel landscape, not really being tied down to anything in particular until you really got around to West Coast Avengers. And then around that same time, he got his own solo series. Now, the reason why I bring this up and mention this is because with Doug Moench being the guy who spearheaded Marvel, Doug Moench ended up leaving Marvel Comics. And there were some disagreements going on behind the scenes between Moench and Jim Shooter, as there were with a lot of people in Jim Shooter. But Doug Moench actually ended up leaving to go write for DC Comics, where he basically wrote Batman and Detective Comics. And so in an effort to try to find a way to rework Moon Knight to make it more popular for modern audiences as they'd been at the time, Marvel basically ended up launching a mini-series that was referred to as Moon Knight Fist of Khonshu that was designed to kind of rework rework the character. And this is also one of those things, one of those stories really going into the next volume that dealt a lot with the idea of him having multiple personality disorder. Now, one of the things that was hit on in the early days is that he might have actually been schizophrenic, but that's also one of those misinterpretations where schizophrenia and multiple personality disorder are perceived as being the same thing. They're not, right? Schizophrenia is just the inability to distinguish reality from fantasy. Multiple personality disorder is literally having multiple personalities. But that's where that early depiction began to come from, with Marc Spector basically being unable to differentiate whether or not his real identity was Jake Lockley or Steve Grant or Marc Spector or even Moon Knight, right? Like it was difficult for him to be able to tell the difference. But regardless, with Doug Moench leaving the series and then basically Moon Knight getting his Fists of Khonshu miniseries, essentially the writing duties fell to Chuck Dixon. Now, Chuck Dixon wrote it for about 24 issues and then effectively bailed without really finishing any of the storylines that he had. And so what you got were just a series of successive writers that were trying to wrap up existing storylines and then also trying to basically, bring back what readers they could, because people were just dropping the series left and right. And that's why you ended up seeing the return of Randall, because seeing Randall return was basically a lot of old school fans seeing the series returning to what made it great in the first place, right? Like the old Doug Moench days. And so with Terry Kavanagh being the writer at the time, what you got was the Blood Brothers saga. And this was actually more of a team-up story between the Punisher and Marc Spector than anything else. And so the idea behind this is that, sort of following the tracks of like the old Doug Moench stories, what Terry Kavanagh did was quite literally have Marlene attacked by a guy, and then immediately within like the first pages of it happening, that it basically turned out to be Randall, right? That Randall had somehow returned. And it was one of those funny things, because with Randall having been gone for so long, Terry Kavanagh seemingly just kind of picked up right where they left off, right? That as soon as Marc Spector realizes that it was Randall that had attacked Marlene, that the mask had basically been left behind when Marlene had pulled it off, that he realized it was the mask of Randall, and is quite literally a flashback to the old Doug Moench story back in the old Hulk magazine. And so from there, it's quite literally Moon Knight just sort of tracking down Randall everywhere he possibly can and trying to find a way to defeat him. At the same time, you also had the Punisher, who was hot on the trail of what were basically advanced idea mechanics weapons that were being brought in through a weapons shipment in the city of New York. And so all this traced back basically to a woman by the name of Nephthys. Now, the whole idea behind this, and it was one of those things that was somewhat interesting, so depending on who you talk to, some people will love it and some people will hate it, that over the course of those conflicts anyway, Punisher and Marc Spector working together and so on and so forth, what you ended up finding out is that Randall and Nephthys were basically lovers at one point in time when Randall was a mercenary. Of course, Nephthys was as well. But what you ended up finding out is that somewhere along the line, Randall had been injured and had actually witnessed Marc Spector being brought before the statue of the Egyptian god Khonshu and basically being resurrected, and that Randall wanted that exact same kind of power. Of course, himself being injured, approaching the statue, praying to it, hoping for some kind of enhancement, and ultimately not getting it. But he also stumbled across a kind of prophecy of sorts that basically said that like somebody was destined to replace Marc Spector as like the new Moon Knight, right? To basically, be the new Fist of Khonshu. And the idea is that it would be Randall. And so what they did is they essentially took a person and then brainwashed them, used a series of chemical modifications and so on, and essentially duped that person into believing they were actually Randall. And so when Marc Spector and Randall initially fought in the old school Hulk magazine comics, that was not actually Randall. Instead, it was just a great big huge ruse, all leading to this moment. And the idea was to essentially use a combination of technology and magic to enhance Randall himself and actually give him a host of different powers, which he got, right? He got like bulletproof skin, and he had enhanced strength and durability and so on and so forth. And so it ultimately all just kind of came down to like a battle to the death between himself and Marc, which, as you would expect, ultimately saw Marc coming out on top. Now, the funny thing about this is that it was not actually Marc who defeated Randall. It was actually the Punisher who defeated Randall. Now, the way that worked is that with Randall having like bulletproof skin, Terry Kavanagh had to kind of find a way to work around this, right? Almost sort of wrote himself into a corner. What you basically ended up getting was just the Punisher's knowledge on how to overcome different people who were out there. And so he literally ended up shooting Randall to pieces, right? Just like shot this guy up. With Randall having what was in effect bulletproof skin, he was very similar to Luke Cage. And in fact, he was identical to Luke Cage in terms of how his powers worked. His skin was bulletproof, but his internal organs were still pretty, they were just your standard internal organs. And so when he was ultimately knocked out of a building by the Punisher, he ended up just kind of crash landing to the ground, which basically shattered his body, and that was it, right? It was just essentially believed this guy was basically dead. And so following this, Randall didn't reappear for years. In fact, it was something like 10 years. In fact, I think it was a little longer than that. It was about 16 years. He didn't show back up again until 2010 with the Shadowland event. Now, I loved Shadowland. I thought it was a great story. The Moon Knight tie-in was kind of dumb. I don't know exactly why Marvel decided to bring Randall back after all this time. It wasn't as though Randall was one of those plot threads that fans had just kind of been clamoring for. They wanted to see him return or something like that. I mean, the run of Moon Knight, right, the Marc Spector Moon Knight series, volume 3, that ended with issue number 60, and Moon Knight just sort of free-floated around Marvel for a little while until he eventually got his own solo series again, which was canceled shortly after it was launched. But the Daredevil Shadowland event was a phenomenal story because what it actually dealt with was basically Matt Murdock being possessed by the Beast of the Hand, right? For those of you guys who don't know what the Hand is, it's the mystical ninja organization based out of Japan. It was basically a unification that was brought together by Kagenobu Yoshioka like way back in the day. And then once they started worshiping the Beast, that's when they started gaining like the mystical abilities to resurrect the dead, right? So the Hand only ever operates in one of two ways. Either they'll send like a single assassin in to take you out, or they'll just send like 500 of them, right? Like you'll literally just be like 100 ninjas all just descending on you. That's usually what they do when like Wolverine fights the Hand because of his healing factor and his ferocity, his berserker rage and all that kind of stuff. They just send a ton of mystical ninjas after him. But Daredevil had basically been possessed by the Beast. And then he ended up turning Hell's Kitchen into what was called Shadowland when he effectively created a kind of empire for himself. Now at the end of the story, of course, Danny Rand, the Iron Fist, ended up like freeing him from possession of the Beast, and then Matt Murdock killed himself and then was immediately resurrected by Elektra, and just it was a cool story. It had some wonky moments here and there, but as far as Moon Knight goes, essentially what had happened is the return of Randall was never clearly fleshed out. Basically, he had actually ended up surviving, and that he was basically being brought before the Hand to kind of work for them in order to take out Moon Knight and then replace him to basically become an agent of the Hand. Of course, Daredevil operating under the assumption that like he would not be defeated, which is of course how most villains end up operating. And so what you got in that story was something that was very much akin to the old Maximum Carnage storyline, right? Where Carnage showed up and then he basically would like kill people and then write like Maximum Carnage or like Carnage Rules, like he would write that kind of stuff in blood. That when Randall showed up, much like his previous iterations, he was essentially insane. And so he immediately started killing a whole ton of people to draw the attention of Marc Spector. And when Marc Spector didn't catch up to him fast enough, he attacked Marlene. Now Marlene didn't die, but good Lord, this girl couldn't catch a break. She ended up having a miscarriage as a result of the attack. But this level of ferocity ended up sending Marc Spector into overdrive, who basically ended up tracking down Randall to the city of New Orleans. Now, this conflict actually spanned a variety of different locations, but where Marc Spector was chasing Randall, Randall was chasing what was called the Crescent of the Moon. Now, the whole idea behind the Crescent of the Moon is that it was the only known artifact that could actually kill the Beast. And so it was really more of a mission that was assigned to Randall by Daredevil in order to ensure Daredevil's continued reign while being possessed by the Beast. But the fight between the two got pretty extreme, all the way to the point that when Randall was pushed to the place where he was effectively going to lose, kind of revealing his identity to Marc Spector yet again, he strapped a bomb to himself with the intention of blowing everybody up. And then of course, Marc Spector ended up killing him with the Crescent because of the fact that Randall had bulletproof skin. The Crescent was the only way to really kill him, and that was the end of Randall. The reality is we haven't seen him since. Whether or not we will is anybody's guess. There's no reason to believe we will. He was never a significant character. He was a character that Marvel just kind of brought back every so often in an effort to try to tell fans, hey, like we're going back to the Doug Moench days. And then by the time he returned during Shadowland, nobody really cared because most people who were reading comics at the time didn't even know who he was. He was just a random guy that turned out to be the brother of Marc Spector. So the significance of the history between the two was largely lost on them. That combined with the handling of the story was okay, but it just didn't really resonate with readers at the time. And so the result of this is that Marvel never really had a reason to bring him back. More recently in Marvel Comics, those of you guys who are curious, and we're actually covering it here on the channel, in the Marc Spector stories and the Moon Knight stories, what you actually have, what's going on right now anyway, is something called the Midnight Mission, where he's basically like running his own thing and, you know, doing his kind of, you know, saving people at night who need it, and people can come and ask for him, you know, ask for help and different things like that. But you've actually got what's called the left hand of Khonshu, the other fist of Khonshu, basically a person who's kind of like the antithesis to Moon Knight. How that will play out is anybody's guess. But I would say that with regards to Ethan Hawke, and we'll talk more about this on Geek Culture Explained, but with regards to Ethan Hawke, he's probably a combination of the two, right? That is basically a kind of continuation of the story of what if Randall had actually gotten the power of Moon Knight in addition to Marc Spector himself, right? The blessing of Khonshu. And he's basically a combination of like the current other fist of Khonshu with the history of Randall Spector. So with that being said, guys, we're going to bring this to an end. Thank you guys for watching, and I will catch you all later. Peace.